Hey there, my name's Daryl Obert. Welcome to the Unreal Studio webinar on look development, specifically around automotive workflows. So today the webinar is going to be hosted by myself, as well as Wes from Substance and Marc from X-Rite. We're going to start off looking at the look development workflow inside of Unreal Studio and how I basically lit this scene. In the middle of the presentation, we're going to have Marc from X-Rite talk about measured materials and how we can capture reality and use that as some of our texturing options inside of Unreal Studio. We'll also have Wes from Allegorithmic talk about the Substance workflow and make all kinds of amazing materials inside of Unreal Studio. We'll finish off inside of Unreal Studio, where I'm going to build some basic user interface elements, as well as introduce you to the multi-user template and how we can use that to publish our results. So before we get started, there's a couple of things I want to go over, and one of those is the rich legacy and the power of Unreal Studio. It's based on the Unreal Engine, and this engine's being used all over the place to do all kinds of interesting things in the enterprise space. And we actually have a dedicated team focused to help you with your enterprise business, which is the team that I'm actually part of. Another interesting fact is how fast Unreal Engine's growing in the enterprise space. CG Architect recently found that it was the fastest growing renderer among its users. And keep in mind that Unreal Studio is still free as it's in the beta. So with that said, what can Unreal Studio be used for? Well, it can be used to all kinds of things. You can do traditional media like still outputs and animations, but you can also generate amazing interactive applications, both in AR, VR, or on the desktop, specifically to help you communicate your design to your clients and to your users. So it's a super, super cool tool. The other thing that's kind of interesting about the engine is because we're a platform, you can basically build your experience once and then deploy it on a variety of different platforms. And this is all the kind of heavy lifting that we take care of inside of the Unreal Studio environment. So keep that in mind as you're working with it. So let's go ahead and jump into our project, and it's based on these awesome assets. All right, so here we are inside of Unreal Studio, and this is what the final shot ends up looking like. So what I want to do is kind of explain to you a few of the things that I think are kind of cool about this, and then we'll dissect the scene, and I'll share with you some tips and tricks on how I approach lighting an automotive asset inside of Unreal Studio. So the assets actually came from a couple different places. The environment I got from Jay, and it ended up coming in through 3ds Max through Datasmith, and then the car actually started off as an alias wire file. And again, everything can come in to Unreal Studio through Datasmith, which is just a really amazing file translator that we've been developing. So it brings in alias wire files, VRED files, SolidWorks files, a whole variety of CAD data comes in extremely elegantly, very, very high fidelity, high quality assets ingested into Unreal Studio through Datasmith. So it's super, super cool. So with that said, I want to also mention that the car came from Substance, and this was the car that was done for their painter contests that actually just finished this week. So thank you so much to those guys for sharing the asset with us to base our webinar around. So the way the scene is lit is actually the way it looks. It's pretty straightforward. We've got this big, soft, diffuse bounce light that's above the car. Very traditional way of photographing a car. Practical photography is done this way all the time for vehicles. And then we've obviously got a few massive spotlights that are kind of flooding the front and the back of the car. And then I've got two more little spots that I've focused in just on the wheels to give the wheels and the brakes that little bit of sparkle and that little bit of pop. So that's essentially the way it's lit, though, is the way it looks. And the majority of the light is obviously coming from this massive diffuse light. That's just actually flooding the whole environment. You'll notice that all the house lights are off. So all of the light that you're seeing essentially is just GI bounce light coming out mainly from this big light on top. So if we kind of just zoom in on the car here, you'll notice as I fly by this concrete, this is actually being done. We'll kind of zoom down here and get low on that concrete. That's actually using a substance that came in through Substance Source. The brakes on the vehicle are through Substance Source. There's Substance textures all over this asset. And you can see that we've got this really beautiful quality of light on this car that's happening. And that is, especially if you look at, how hot it is right here and how it kind of just gradients down and tapers off. I've got a few other cameras that we're going to kind of look around on this vehicle. So we'll just jump up to an above the shoulder shot here. And as I move this camera around here, you can see I've got a fair bit of bloom and glow on there. It might be a little strong, but I actually kind of like it. And there's a little bit of depth of field happening in here. So if we just sort of fly this camera in onto the car here, the focal point is going to be right around on that wheel. So as I start to drop my camera down and sort of pan around here, you'll see if I shoot down the length of the car, we're going to get this really nice depth of field kind of blowing out the front end of the car, but we're keeping this kind of detail area around that wheel and tire and all the brakes nice and precise. And again, just as I move the camera around here, you get a sense of how beautiful the metal flake is, how all the reflections are kind of flowing across the car in a very nice, realistic way. And I've got a few more cameras that are kind of fun to just check out, like this back shot to me looks really nice, especially this little balloon that kind of happens right there. And then on the shoulder of the car, it starts to peel up and shoot off that corner line of the car right there, which again looks pretty sweet. We've got another one. It's just sort of wrapping around the side of the car here. And again, all that light that you're seeing that's bouncing into the back of the environment is being done. It's all bounce light that's being filled into that environment. And as I kind of pan across the car here, you'll notice this side's going to look a little bit different because we're not hitting it with all those spotlights. So you definitely get this much softer look. You get this very quality, pure character lines with no distractions or kind of hot spots. So a lot of times this is going to be the desired look. You might want something that's actually this soft, so you can get that by just having that white wraparound box being your primary light source, and it looks very different, looking out this way than it does when we're looking back into the box. So, just options that you have when you're lighting your car. Think of that as a practical photo shoot, and you'll find yourself getting really quality results very, very quickly with Unreal Studio. So let's just jump over to, I think this 50 is on the front side of the car. Yeah, so you can see we kind of get this nice front shot there, and notice the effect of that light as it kind of peels behind and blooms over top of that, the roof line of the car there, and it just looks pretty sweet. So that's basically it as far as, the overall look and feel. Let's go ahead and jump in there, and I'll walk you through the process of how I set the lighting up and share some tips and tricks with you guys. All right, so here we are in a simplified version of the scene to talk about lights and the different types of lights in Unreal Studio. And it looks really dark. The reason it's so dark is currently there's no lights in the scene that are turned on. We do have some emissive piped into the shader of that big box light, so that's giving us that bright spot on the top of the screen. And then obviously on the shoulder of the car here, we're getting some reflection of that light from screen-based reflections, but for all practical purposes, there's no light in the scene. So let's drag a point light out to start talking about the three different types of lights that Unreal Studio has. So as I move this light around, you can see we're getting this nice direct illumination model with these real-time shadows. And as I previously mentioned, there's three unique types of lights. You have stationary lights, static lights, and movable lights. So the static light is the highest quality light. All the light information is baked into the light mask maps. Pretty straightforward. Movable lights are exactly what they sound like. They're movable. They're completely dynamic in every way, but they're not quite as high quality as the other two lights. And then you have the hybrid light, which is the stationary light that sort of has a mixture of both. So with a stationary light, the light can't move, but you can change the intensity of the light. And the way the shadows works is based on whether or not the object is animated or not. So if the object isn't animated, it's going to bake the shadows. If the object is animated that is passing in front of the light, it's going to use dynamic shadows. So it really is sort of this hybrid. And knowing those differences and those limitations will help you choose what type of light you want to use. And often you'll use a combination. So for this scene, I actually ended up using primarily stationary lights with a couple static lights here and there, just because I know I wanted to be able to dial in how much the wheel was going to get hit and popped on and things like that. So let's walk you through the process of how I actually set my lighting up. So I didn't use a point light for the top of the car here. I actually used an area light or a rectangle light. So we'll just kind of drag that guy out, and let's just push this up here and get that guy so that it's going to sort of drop right onto, and then we'll just sort of move it over here. And you can see that we're getting this really nice big box light. We're simulating that box light with this rectangular light. And then obviously, once you do something like that, you're going to want to set the color temperature in all your lights. Very important not to leave them white. I think I ran around 5800 or 5600 on most of my lights when I lit this scene. Another thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to tell this light that you want it to use high quality area shadows when it does the rendering. So if you come down here, you're going to want to click on the use area shadows for stationary light. So that's going to give it, kind of this. So with that done, we'll go in here and we'll just increase the intensity of this. And I think I pushed it up to something like 100. It was pretty bright on top of the car. And the next thing that I did is I went through and I actually added in point lights or spotlights where all the geometry-based spotlights were. So I've already got those guys in my scene. So we'll just grab all of those and we'll turn those on. So again, with these lights, if we just kind of frame in on this guy and spin around here, it's a good idea to give your lights an actual size. So if you scroll down on this guy, you're going to see that I've got its size, its source radius set. So the source radius gives it an actual volume, which means when these shadows come down here, they're going to be really crisp where it touches on the tire, but as they get further away from the car, because there's an actual volume, you're going to get kind of that parallax effect happening, and you're going to get soft shadows based on the distance from the actual object. So it's always a good idea. Another good tip is to always turn those guys on. So these lights, you're going to want to increase their attenuation so that they kind of continue through the scene. Pretty straightforward on that. And the final thing that I did is I actually also went through on each one of these guys. So if we let's just frame it on this guy one more time and kind of spin around on this guy. I went through and I actually put a point light inside of that guy so that it could, start to give it a little bit of, wrong intensity slider on that guy. Let's go back to that point light. I gave it these little point lights so that I can kind of blow that out inside of there. And, I think I ran that around to something like a value of 5. So each one of the spotlights, I actually ended up putting a point light inside of it also. So for these spotlights, let's just go back and grab those guys. I'm just going to go ahead and turn their type over to stationary. So we'll just do something like that so that we can adjust their brightness after we bake the lighting. So now that we've done that, that was my base. That's it. That was my basic lighting setup. You have to go through and you have to process the lighting now. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to process this lighting at a quality, just like a medium quality, not too high, because we'll jump over to the final light bake in just a second after we do a few more things. So let's go ahead and process this lighting out at a medium quality. All right, so here we are. We just finished our light bake after a couple of minutes, and if we hit the G key to turn off those lights, you can see that we're getting pretty decent results. Even at medium quality and relatively low resolution on the light bake, we still have a lot of information here, and it's definitely giving me what I need to know to start making some more creative decisions. Now, if you remember those 4 lights that were on the front part of the car, we set to be stationary lights, which means they have the ability to be edited after the baking process. So if I take my intensity and increase it, you can see that I've just brightened up the brakes, I brightened up the back and the tail of the car. Then obviously if I wanted to get rid of the effect of those lights, I could zero those out. So that flexibility you have with stationary lights is actually pretty awesome. Now keep in mind, stationary lights, you can only have 4 of them at any given time that intersect each other. You can have more than 4 in your scene, but their volumes have to be clipped so that they don't actually intersect each other. And that just has to do with the way the lights are held and calculated and thought about by the engine. There's a limitation of 4 of them at any given time. So something to be aware of when you're working with stationary lights. So now that we've got that done, the next thing that we want to do is we want to start to add in some higher quality materials on the paint of the car as well as the wheels and things like that. So to do that, we're actually going to jump over to the marketplace. And in the marketplace, you want to download the automotive materials. So these are a variety of materials that were generated by the guys at Epic as well as McLaren. So it was a joint project that was done with the McLaren folks. And the end materials are actually really great. It's an awesome starting off point. There's a lot of car paint materials with some beautiful metal flakes, really good carbon fibers, caliper materials. A lot of the materials that you actually saw in the car, the silver version of the car, were actually done using these McLaren presets from the automotive materials. So once you get them downloaded, you're going to want to inject them or merge them into your current project. So it's very easy to do. Just go to the map for the automotive materials, right mouse click on that, and say Actions, Migrate. So that's going to be everything that's going to get sent over. It's worth mentioning that the materials are based on a master and instance workflow, which is the ideal workflow. So it gives you the ability to, instance materials give you the flexibility of modifying and making parameter changes in real time. So it's a very kind of standard workflow, but worth mentioning that this is set up that way. So you basically will browse to your directory of the project you want to merge them into and hit go, and then they'll just show up in your project. So if we jump over to our car and we jump over to the materials automotive, you can see I now have all the same materials in my project because they were migrated over previously. So with that done, what we're going to want to do is we're going to start to want to dress the car with a few of these materials. And when I put these on here, you'll notice that they don't really look like they did in that original scene that I showed you guys, that first scene. And the reason they look so different right now isn't because of the lighting, it's because of the reflections. So a lot of what's going to happen with these automotive materials and automotive renders in general is the quality of the overall look of the render is going to be based on lighting as well as reflections, because so many of the surfaces are really, really reflective surfaces. So currently in our scene, we only have screen-based reflections happening. We don't have any reflection captures in our scene. So you're going to want to start adding reflection captures to your environment to start to improve the quality. And there's a kind of strategy to it, and I've actually been kind of playing around with it, and I'll share with you the way I set the reflections up on my vehicle now. So to begin the reflections, the first thing we're going to do is just jump over to Visual Effects and drag a cube reflection map. And if you hit the G key and kind of zoom out, you can see that it's basically going to give me a big cubic reflection capture for the full environment. And if we kind of zoom back into the car, you can see that it starts to look obviously much better than it did without any reflections. If we actually look at the reflections directly though, you'll see that they're not that high quality. They're not very precise around the vehicle. So what the strategy is you have a group of reflections for the environment as well as very specific reflections placed around the car. And I kind of came up with a strategy that works pretty well. What I discovered is if you position a combination of box reflections and spherical reflections that are very precise to the kind of planar surfaces of the car, it actually starts to work pretty well. So if you make your transition distance kind of small, something like 50, and then kind of tag this down to 100 by 100 by 100 to sort of get where you're starting to see where it is. We can make something like this guy be 50 and this guy be like 30. So what you want to do is you want to place a reflection sort of on the roof, and maybe this will be a little bit longer, something like 150 or something kind of like that. You don't want to have it passing through the roof. You want to have it just sort of floating up there like that, and maybe a little less wide, something like 80 wide. Maybe we can go 45 on that guy. Actually, let's go down to 30 on that guy. So that starts to look pretty good. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're just going to alt drag that guy out and position it kind of right there on the hood. And then obviously we don't need it to be quite that long. We can probably make this something like 100 for the length on that guy. So the idea is you're going to kind of position these around, again, trying to capture the main planes of the car. So down the sides, we're going to do kind of a big slab that kind of runs down the side, something sort of like this. Again, positioning them where they start to have those reflections flow and do the things that look appropriate. I mean, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is we're trying to basically make a chrome car that looks pretty convincing. And with a little bit of time and a little bit of care, you can do this relatively quickly. So the final thing that I did is I went through and I actually filled in areas with some spherical reflections also. So I'll just kind of show you that really quickly. Let's just grab a spherical reflection, kind of position that guy really small as far as its transition radius goes, and kind of just, kind of plop it in somewhere sort of like that. And then after you've gotten a few of these placed, you might want to do some for the wheels too. So again, you can just kind of alt and then drag that guy sort of out to where it's going to kind of float right in front of that wheel. And this should be more in that range. Once you've kind of positioned these guys where you think they're going to work well, you go back and you say rebuild the reflections. So we're going to build the reflection captures. Takes just a second, and the end result starts to look like I said, like sort of like a chrome car that's really mimicking, you're getting this big long reflection from that box light that's above the car. You're getting on the kind of coming across this belt line that's rising, the ground bouncing up and giving you that bright reflection on the ground. Then obviously on the roof, we're getting kind of the same thing. So it's starting to work actually pretty well. Now, one thing that's worth mentioning is in your system preferences or your project settings, you're going to want to change a few things. You're going to want to go in here and increase the size of the reflection capture. So if you just do a search for reflection and make your reflection captures, I do 512 or 1024. Another thing that you're going to want to change in project settings is going to be the clear coat. So the clear coat a lot of those automotive materials is using clear coat, and some of them are doing things to the normal, the second normal in the clear coat, specifically the carbon fibers. So you're going to want to have clear coat enabled, turned on. And the final thing that I do is I also increase the dynamic range, luminance range, and use the exposure settings. So this makes it just much easier to fine tune. It makes it have a value range that's pretty standard for photography work. It works in stops. So those are the 3 tips for project settings: clear coat, extend the range, and fix the resolution size for your reflection captures, and you'll have pretty good success. So the end result ends up looking something kind of like this, which, looks pretty good, not so bad. Now, obviously, we can go in here and we can start to add in some more automotive materials. Like if we come up here to the carbon fiber and, put like this carbon fiber on the roof, it's gonna, it just starts to look really, really cool, and you get these beautiful, beautiful reflections off of that from those reflections that we just placed, and then obviously you get, this really nice kind of, orange peel effect kind of coming off those metals and the metal flake and stuff. So it's just not so bad. So that is basically it for my strategy on setting up reflections. The final thing that we're going to talk about is post-processing. And the post-processing to me it's like the magic. It's magic. It's so cool. Let's check it out. All right, so the post-processing volume's really given this scene the final polish. And the first thing you want to do is make sure that the extend infinite is turned on. That makes the post-processing volume cover the whole scene. Now, one of the things I'm doing with the post-process volume is I'm using it to manage the bloom and the glow in this scene pretty extensively. So I've got that bloom cranked up to a very high value because I really wanted it to burn out, specifically around the lights in the really hot spots. And I've got that threshold set very high so that only the brightest pixels are kicking it off. So notice the effect if I drop that down to 0. The scene gets really washed out and there's a lot more glow and bloom happening. So I'm using this threshold to kind of clamp that kind of range back down to something that looks a little bit more realistic, sort of like there, which looks really pretty good to me. I like that. So the other thing that I'm doing is I'm using this to lessen the amount of lens flare. If we put this back to something like a value of 1, it's going to be just a little too crazy. So I'm kind of clamping those lens flares down to something like 0.15. Another thing that I'm using this for is I'm using it to manage my midtone. So if you kind of come down here to my mids, I've actually dropped the contrast down. So you can see it was a little too punchy. That was the default, and that's with the grading that I've done to it. I've also used a little bit of offset because when I changed the contrast, it just got a little too washed out. So I'm darkening it up a little bit more. So the final thing that I'm using the post-process volume for is to also manage the way the ambient occlusion works. So the way the ambient occlusion works in the scene, the way I have it set up, is I'm actually got a very small radius. The default radius is something like 200. So if we put this to the default radius, you're going to see, it really starts to add in ambient occlusion in a lot of areas where I don't want it. I really want that ambient occlusion just to kind of handle the really tight areas. And you can really see the effect of it if we kind of spin around here and look at the back side of this building. So what I've got is if we put the radius back to something like 200, you get this kind of ambient effect happening in here. And I'm also using the fade off so that it basically turns the ambient occlusion off when you're far away from things. Let's just eject out of the depth of field camera and kind of rise back up here. Let's look at them inside the car. So if I turn these guys back on, you can see that my background objects now really are getting much, much less ambient occlusion with the settings that I have. And it just seems to make the scene work a lot better and just look, a whole lot more realistic. And you get a sense of that kind of glow and bloom that happens really beautifully, actually, when you kind of look at these lights. I mean, I know it's about a car, but just the light itself looks so cool. So those are the final things that I've done. Oh, and the last little thing that I did, which is actually a pretty fun little trick, is don't be afraid to use lights. Like I've got a little tiny area light that I put underneath the car that I'm just turned on to darken it because it was, or to lighten it because it was just a little too dark underneath there. So just that little tiny bit of area light underneath the car just kind of makes that shadow fit with the balance of the scene ever so slightly better. So that is basically the end effect of all the post-processing work that I did to give this the final look and feel. Hopefully you guys dig it. Cheers.
All right, so that was the first chunk, obviously covering off a fair bit of look development work inside of Unreal. And next, I want to introduce you to Marc. He's going to be talking to you about X-Rite and measured materials and how you can use those to take your your designs to the next level. So let's go ahead and cue that up and check out his presentation.
All right, thanks, Daryl, for that introduction. My name is Marc Ellens, and I work for X-Rite, X-Rite Pantone. Some of you might be familiar with that name. X-Rite is involved with doing color measurement and management for lots of different industries. Some of our more common features include monitor calibrations and color paint matching and the Graytech Macbeth color checker chart. Some of those things that you should be hopefully familiar with. X-Rite's been in existence for a while, and we're really moving now from not just color, but into the more appearance space. Today I want to talk to you about digital twins of physical materials in our Total Appearance Capture initiative. And it's great that we're involved here with Unreal and Allegorithmic to really focus on how we can make materials much more realistic in this workflow. So the typical workflow, I just have a couple slides here, but in the typical workflow, the artistic process is used to develop materials. And this is still part of the process. This isn't going away anytime soon. But what we really want is to focus on materials that are highly accurate to those we see in the physical world. And to do that, we've made some progress by using texture scanners like flatbed scanners or photos, processing those images and producing the different maps that you need for spatially varying BRDF formats. But ultimately, what we want is a fully measured, photorealistic, physically correct measurement based on a bunch of maps that come from the material as being represented in its physical world in the correct form. And to get highly accurate, complex materials, we need to be able to measure all of these characteristics. We want them to be scene independent, so we need to be able to transport them. We need to be able to light them in different environments. So how are we going to do that? So the total appearance capture that we provide at X-Rite produces an appearance exchange file format. This is called AXF. This AXF file contains all the maps that you would use in a spatially varying BRDF, and these maps are the common format that is often used inside of rendering engines, being the diffuse, specular, normal maps, height maps, these kinds of things. And all of these files are contained within a single AXF file, and included on top of that are some metadata information that you can use to manage this particular material through the workflow. Fortunately, today we're showing you how these can be integrated into Unreal. But as you can see, the network of applications that AXF files are integrated into is pretty extensive. This is growing, so this is even kind of old at this point. But hopefully we'll be able to show you the value of this within this application. So what does this technology look like? So this is comprised of 3 different areas, the TAC7 scanner. This thing we can use to actually place the materials on the inside. It measures a large amount of data, and this data is scanned and produced and consolidated into a single file format called AXF. That's using the Pantora Digital Material Hub. We can not only process that data, but we can edit it, prepare it for rendering. And then from there, we will take that and we can validate it using our virtual light booth. This is a visualization platform that's a light booth an actual light booth in the front where you can place your physical material, and a digital light booth in the back where you can compare your material development. These particular things are all for sale. They're in production at this point. I'd like to kind of show you a little bit more in depth what Pantora does and how it manages materials. And so with that, we will move over to Pantora. All right, so here we are with Pantora. Pantora is our software that we use to actually process and manage the data that we get from the TAC7. And then once those are processed, then the materials gets placed into the browser window. Once you select this particular directory, the thumbnails are loaded from the AXF files. And then you can take these individual files and copy them into the window tray in the bottom, which then allows you to manage these materials in an editing process. Then we can go into the editor. So the editor provides a way for us to actually take the material and make sure that it's suitable for use in processing or in rendering. So as you can see, this one unedited, there's a slight little gradient in the material that causes us to be able to see where the edges of the material are. So this is something that is very common when you're trying to take an image that you've scanned or that you've taken a photograph of. You have to manage the repeat. So these tools in here are very easy to manage. So we have different sections. The first section in the texture tools enables us to crop. So we can change the crop border of this. We can also make this a non-rectangular, trapezoidal, quadrilateral, and the material, all the maps at the same time get stretched to fit that. We can also set this up so that you can do smaller or larger than your crop. It just takes pieces of the repeated area, and to do that you just select this multi-view. But for now we'll just go down and we'll keep this entire crop area. The second thing that we can do, which is something that we noticed here in the gradients, is we can just do gradient removal, and this is typically a single click button. Here you can see the item as cropped in repeat. Here you can see the full 3D rendering. This is a 2D preview, but it includes all the aspects of the material together. So as we go down and we click on these gradient removals, you can see the changes not only in the repeated value of that particular map, but also in the full 3D view or the full material view here on the right hand side. So we'll just go through and select all of these and remove the gradients, and as you can see it's slowly improving. And now that we've done gradient removal across all of those, there's virtually no seam that you can see here on the right hand side. So we've effectively eliminated the repeat boundary detection that we can do visually, and so now we're saying, okay, I think we can use this material. So there's a few other kinds of edits that you can do. To illustrate this, I will just swap out my changes that I have here and show you different kinds of material here that's a little bit more tricky. This one, what I've done is I've done some edits already. I've cropped a different area. I've done some gradient removal. And now what I'm doing down here is I'm making this seamless by doing a texture synthesis. So this texture synthesis takes little pieces of this material and extracts them out, all of the maps at the same time, and then places them back together, stitches them back together to make a single material. So as you can see, this generates a much larger repeat area. In particular, this one is about twice as big as the original size. To check on a 3D model within Pantora itself, one of the things that we have is a viewer. So this is a light booth that we've set up, where we have this basically speed shape or blob where you can just drag and drop your materials onto this particular model. So once that's loaded, you can rotate as you would expect in a 3D CAD program. This particular object is replaceable, and as well as the environment. So in order to do that, you can just load individual environments or individual objects and customize exactly how you want to see this. So once you have the material that you've decided is good, you can either validate it in the VLB, or you can take it directly into your rendering application. In this particular case, we're going to switch over to Unreal and show you what these materials look like inside of Unreal. So now we've moved from Pantora into Unreal, and we have an automobile that we've already loaded. It already has some car paint on it. As you can see, we have some materials that have been already loaded from our demo library set. In order to import new materials, we click on the import button, and you can just pick a particular paint that you want to have loaded, a particular AXF file. Specify the bake settings, and here we're just going to make some slight changes. You can modify those according to what you need. And then once the material loads, it will create its own folder inside of the currently selected folder in your materials, and create a material as well as a number of assets associated with it. So we'll let this load here a second. And now you can see that we have this new material, the material itself with 3 different assets associated with it. You can manage these materials just by double-clicking on them. And you can see what we've actually brought into and extracted from the AXF file and loaded into the material that's in Unreal. So these parameters, of course, because they're in Unreal, you can feel free to change them artistically as you want. Some of the things to point out are this master tiling, which is going to come in at roughly 30, and you can change that according to what you need. That's more interesting for the SVB-RDF format. And then there's an option for doing the flake normals. And usually these will come in with a pretty flat normal, and here that's the case. We have no normal associated with this. You may feel free to actually provide a normal, and to do that you can select from any of the already loaded normals that you might happen to have, including from other materials. And here we'll apply the leather as part of the clear coat, just so that you can see the difference. Once you're done with that, we can just drag and drop this onto our individual car paints. Now in this particular case, we put an interesting clear coat on there. So I'm going to actually switch and do another paint that I've got loaded, so that you can kind of see the flakes that are in this model. So let's zoom in, have a look, and see. You can see that this particular paint has some flakes right here in the bottom. This front part, you can see the flakes even better in this this large flake gray that's in the inside here. So moving on, we'll go into the inside and have a look at the inside of this vehicle. And here we are looking at some leathers. So these leathers look pretty good, but let's say we want to change them by adding new SVB-RDF file from X-Rite. So we can pick one of these SVB-RDF leathers. We'll just go with the defaults for now. And we'll load these into Unreal and have a look and see what they're all about. So now we can drag and drop these on the inside here. Now you can see we've changed this leather to something that's a little bit more colorful, a little bit more dynamic, depending on the kind of car that you want. So that's how easy it is to use inside of Unreal. I'm not an expert at this, so I'm going to hand it over to the experts to take this even further.
That was awesome, Mark. Thank you so much for that. Super educational. Next up is going to be Wes. Wes is going to be walking you through some really exciting stuff also. So hey there, Wes.
Hey everyone, thanks a lot for joining us here. So yes, my name is Wes McDermott. I work for Allegorithmic, and my job is I'm integrations product manager. So I work with the engineering team that works on the plugins for DCC applications and game engines such as Unreal. So our team works on the Unreal Engine plugin, and so that's what my video part's going to show. We're going to talk about the Substance plugin, live link, and access to Substance source. So I'll just let the video speak for itself. Thanks a lot. In this demonstration, I'm going to show you how the Substance plugin works here directly in UE4. So you can grab the Substance plugin for free directly off the UE4 marketplace. And the Substance plugin allows you to work with Substance materials directly here in the editor, as well as establish a live link with Substance Painter. The plugin is free to use, and you can simply just install it to your engine. So one of the first things I want to showcase is the ability to browse the Substance source library directly here within UE4. So at the top of the UI, I'm going to just simply click this source button, and that's going to launch Substance Source. Substance Source is a vast PBR material library that is curated by Allegorithmic and updated monthly. Here I'm just going to do a search for our automotive collection, And then I can browse through all of these materials that are related to automotive design to find a specific material that I want to work with. So once I find something, or if I'm interested in a material, I can simply just click on it and I can view a material preview, as well as I can take a look at the maps that are used to generate this material. So once I find something that I like, I can simply just click this download button, and the material is going to be downloaded directly to my content browser. So what you get here is a material, and I can just drag and drop this material right onto the asset here in the editor. So here I have a substance instance graph, which if I open this here, I'm able to edit the parameters in order to update the textures that are generated by the substance plugin. So for example, here I'm going to change my output size to 2048. The textures are recomputed at this new resolution. And then I can change any parameters. So for example, let's come over here to this color. I'm just going to choose a different color so you can see the textures are updated in real time as we work. So we'll just choose a different value here. So for now, we're going to leave this here just kind of a neutral gray value, and I'll click OK on this. And here I'm going to close out this window, and I want to take a look at the material itself. So here we have the material. I'm going to double click this to open the material editor. And you can see that what we have here is just a regular UE4 material. However, we have the textures here that are generated by the Substance engine, and they're plugged right into the material inputs. So like I said before, editing the Substance parameters will automatically update these textures. Now, in this particular case, I don't have any tiling parameters on this Substance. So what I want to do is set up some tiling here to this material. And what this is going to showcase is that even though we get a material from Substance Source, we can easily augment that material to fit a very specific need just by editing it here in the UE4 material editor. So what I'm going to do here is make a text chord. We'll also make a constant followed by a multiply node. And I'm going to just hook this up here. So now let me take the result of the multiply. I'm just going to plug this here into the UVs for each one of these textures. Again, the textures that are generated here by the Substance engine. All right, so another thing I'm going to do is just right click, and I'm just going to convert this here to a parameter. So let's just save this material, and we'll close this out. Another thing that I can do is I can easily just create a material instance from this as well. So here we'll create just a material instance, and I'm going to now go ahead and apply this material. So now if we take a look at this material, we have here our parameter, and now I can just set some tiling for this. So let me just try here at a value of 4, and this is looking pretty good for what I want to work with here. Another benefit to working with Substance materials is that all of the textures that are generated are seamless, so you can easily tile them as I've shown here. So now what we're going to do, that we have the material set up the way we want, I can now go back to the Substance parameters here, and I can start to make some changes, again, that's going to recompute these texture maps that are fed into that material. So for example, maybe I will come over here to my color and just set a little bit of a darker value to this. Now, we also have the ability to work with our roughness. I feel like this is a bit too shiny for what I want, so I'm just going to increase this roughness amount here slightly. And I can also come down here to where I have my technical parameters. So if I take a look, these technical parameters allow me to essentially do some image processing on these textures. So for example, I can come over and I can increase that normal intensity amount. I could do an increase here in my contrast or adjust my luminosity. So I might lift this value just a bit. And by doing these edits here, you can see that I can work with these textures in real time directly in the editor. I don't have to jump over to another image processing application, make changes, save, update, and so on. I can do it all directly here in real time in the editor using the Substance plugin. So now that I have everything set up like I want, I'm just going to save this here, and we can take a look at the texture that we have. So what we've done here is we've used Substance Source to download a material that we've just quickly applied, made some tweaks, and now we're good to go. So the next thing that I'd like to showcase is how we can use a live link with Substance Painter to texture assets. So here I'm going to texture these seat assets directly in Substance Painter. So what I'm going to do is just right click on the mesh, and I'm just going to send this here to Substance Painter. So now I have Substance Painter and UE4 in split screen. Substance Painter's on the left, and here we have UE4 on the right. I'm going to place the UE4 editor viewport in emissive mode here. And so now we're going to come back to Painter and we can start to work. So the first thing I'm going to do is bake some textures, so bake mesh maps. have a set of bakers here set with an output size of 2048, and I'm going to start baking these maps. This lets you see how fast it is to bake maps here inside of Substance Painter, and we'll use these baked maps in the texturing process with our generators and filters. So I'm also going to change the document resolution to 2048 as well. So now that that's set, I'll just close out the texture set settings. Next thing, I'm going to open my shelf. Here I have a material I'd like to apply, so we'll just drag and drop that here to the layer stack. And Substance Painter is recomputing these maps. It's going to retexture this seat. And you can see that the textures are sent directly over to UE4. And now I can use UE4 as a emissive viewport to just take a look at my textures, just viewing how everything's coming together with the textures in combination with all of the baked lighting. All right, so next I'm going to take a look at adding some seams here to the seat. So to do that, I'm going to come in and start by just creating a fill layer. And I'm just going to disable these channels I don't want. We're going to start with a positive height, and I'm just going to mask this, add a paint effect, and let me choose an alpha that I want to work with here. So we'll just start by just using a basic shape. All right, so let's zoom into this area. I am going to increase my brush size here, and I'm also going to enable my symmetry so that I can paint this effect on both sides of the seat, as well as my lazy mouse. All right, so once I have my brush set up the way that I want here, let's increase that lazy mouse distance. Actually, I need to make sure that my spacing is set correctly as well. Okay, so let's come in here and just start to paint my stroke. So we'll come in and we'll just paint a stroke here. Now, I'm also going to come over here to this mask and add a filter to this as well. We're going to add a blur, and we'll increase this here. So now we get this type of effect. You can see how that's updating here in the UE4 viewport. Now, let's add a fill on top of this, and this time, again, just going to disable all my channels, set this here to a negative value. I'm going to mask it, add a paint. This time here, I'm going to choose a different alpha. So I'm going to choose this thorn here. It's going to give me just a bit of a sharper edge, and I'm going to decrease my brush size on this. Okay, now one of the things, again, on my height, make sure that I'm just using this as a negative value, and now I'm going to come in and paint in another stroke. So now my seam is starting to take shape. I'm going to, once again, create another fill layer here and set this to the height channel. And now we're going to take a look at adding or creating some stitching here on this seam. So let's go in and mask this, and we'll add a paint effect. Going to change my brush, or excuse me, my alpha. So we'll set this over here to a stitch. Use the stitch alpha. For my brush properties, I'm going to choose to enable follow path, increase here my spacing. And now I can come into here and paint my stroke here as well. So we'll come in and we'll just paint the stitching right along the edge here. Now, because Substance Painter supports multi-channel, I could also come back here for this stitch, and I'm going to enable a color. Now, you see, just by enabling the color, I'm able to colorize this stitch here. So maybe I do want to give this just a little bit of color, so we could get something like this here. So as you can see, using the Substance Painter Live Link, I was able to add some extra detail here to the seat, with the textures being updated in real time in relation to the final render here inside of the UE4 viewport.
Super, super cool. Thank you, Wes, for that. So we're going to queue up the last chunk of presentation here, which is going to jump back into Unreal and show you a couple of interesting things that we can do with the engine. All right, so we're going to finish off with two things. The first thing that we're going to talk about really quickly is the multi-user template and how you can add that into your scene. So the multi-user template's easily added to your scene by just saying add a current feature pack and going over to Unreal Studio and just basically saying inject into this file the multi-user viewer. So this adds in all the intelligence to create a multi-user experience. It handles all the really hard things like the networking between the computers, the hosting and the joining of the sessions. It's also completely set up to work with either VR or desktop. So it's super straightforward and easy to work with. And I've actually already injected that into our project. So we're ready to roll with that. All you have to do is basically set up some collision planes and some navigation meshes, and it'll work with your content. So super straightforward to use and very, very powerful. So that's already been done to our scene. The next thing that I want to draw your attention to is in my levels, I've got a new level that I've added that has the blue car. So if we turn the blue car on, this is using obviously that X-Rite measured material, so extremely accurate, very, very realistic, real world material. And the reason I'm switching levels is because you'll notice that when we have the blue car, how much of that kind of blue fill kind of bounces around from the lighting bake. So I just wanted to make sure that I was switching between an actual environment of that background ground plane and not just switching the shader on the car. So we actually rebaked the lighting on this. So obviously that car looks really, really beautiful, especially if you get into some of these cameras that, like this other back camera here has some depth of field on it. And, as you kind of move this around and you get all that glows, all the blooms, all the things that we talked about with the silver car are actually obviously going to look really, really cool on a car that's using a measured material from X-Rite. So super, super sweet looking. I just love that. I think the shock blue that's the one to get for me. So what we want to do is we actually want to make a little UI that's going to switch between these levels. And this is extremely simple to do inside of Unreal Studio. Adding this intelligence in is super, super straightforward. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new blueprint widget, and we'll just call this UI DTO 2, just so I know which one it is, because I've made a few of these guys. And in this UI, what we're going to do is we're going to bring it up. And the first thing we want to do is we just want to add 2 buttons. So we'll add a button for the blue car and a button for the silver car. So for these buttons, we really want to make them have an image, right? We don't want them just to be little buttons. So that's again, just a matter of going to your content and grabbing in a PNG file. So if we kind of scroll up here into my textures, I've got some shader balls already set out with the shock blue. So we're going to put that into the appearance for this guy. Obviously, we want it to be scaled up 100%. And then we're going to use that same shock blue for the hover image as well as the click image. But for the hover image, I'm going to just darken it a little bit, kind of dim it down ever so slightly. So that builds that guy. The next one we want to do is going to be the car silver. So we'll highlight that, and we'll just sort of put that into the hover. We'll put that into the rest. Again, for this hover, we're going to want to darken that up ever so slightly, so it kind of gives me a visual cue that something was happening. And again, obviously we want that for the main image. And of course, we have to put our scale back to 100. So now that we've done that, we've got basically 2 buttons. We can kind of zoom in here and lay these guys out as kind of where we want them. I think they look pretty good like that. Maybe just nudge that guy up ever so slightly. So that's going to be our 2 buttons. Pretty straightforward. So now what we need to do is we need to build some intelligence, build a little graph that's going to say, when I click this button, change that layer. So how do you do that? It's really, really easy. Go into the graph, and in the graph, for each of these buttons, we're going to basically say, so when I click that button on click, I want to do something. So what do I want to do when I click it? I want to stream a level. So I'll just type level. And what we're going to do is we're going to tell it to load the level stream. So that comes in pretty straightforward. So we're going to tell it to make the level visible. And you have to give it the name. The name actually has to be spelled exactly correct or it will not work. So AXTAON. And then we're going to say, I don't remember which one this was. Hopefully this is the blue one. So we're going to load the blue one, and then we can copy and paste that guy. And we're going to load up the silver one. Pretty straightforward. And then we're going to say on button click, we want to do that. So now we've got levels that are going to be loaded when we click those buttons, but obviously we don't want to have both cars on top of each other. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to unload a level. So we're going to say after that's completed, let's just say close a level. So unload level stream, pretty straightforward. So just copy and paste that guy. And then obviously we can copy paste this and come over here, and hopefully I've got everything spelled correctly. So now that we've done that, pretty straightforward, we can go ahead and we can save this. So that's cool, but we need to make this UI load. Now, if I hit play right now, I won't load the UI. So we'll just hit save, we'll close this down, and we'll hit play. So when we hit play, we get the little file load happening. That's part of the multi-user template. And now we're in it. So the multi-user template, it's got a walk character in here. It's got random placement of bookmarks that are kind of set up that you define. It has the ability to do a fly camera and then drop the camera. And it also has this nice little laser pointer that allows you to collaborate with people. So pretty straightforward stuff there. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that UI that we made loads up inside of this. So how do you do that? Well, it's really pretty straightforward. So we'll escape out of that. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to the level blueprint for our project. And you're going to see here, if we kind of scroll over here, this is all the multi-user template stuff. So it's basically creating a little UI. It's giving you some, as you begin, start and add the scenes, load up some sub-levels, all that stuff's kind of all taken care of for us. But what we need to do is we need to come to the very end of this, and we need to say, after that last thing that was part of that multi-user template, we want to display our widget. So we'll just drag this out and say we need to do a new thing, which is create a UI that's going to display. So we'll say create widget, and then we're going to tell it what one we want, which is UI DTO2. And then after we've made that widget, we just need to add it to the viewport. So just drag out and type add, and now we can say add to viewport. And with that done, we can now hit play one more time. We'll save this out, and we'll hit play. So file loading, again, part of the multi-user template. And now you can see here we are in our environment. And if I go and I click on the silver ball, it's going to load the silver car. And then obviously if I go back and click on the blue ball, it's going to load the blue car. So really simple example of how you can go in here and start to build intelligence into your design, into your audit, and start to build some really, really fun car collaborating and car configuring tools. And again, this is all completely set up and ready to run on VR, and I'll be handing out the multi-user compiled version of this so you guys can download it and play around with it yourselves. So thank you so much for taking the time to check it out, everybody. Cheers. All righty, so that is pretty much it. I'm just going to walk you through a few more slides here to kind of wrap everything up and give you a quick overview of what we saw. So in Unreal Studio, obviously we spent the majority of our time doing look development work. We obviously were able to generate some user interface using Blueprint extremely quickly. And we touched on that multi-user template. And keep in mind that the download that you get, if you have multiple computers on your network, you can get a few people kind of running around that environment. You'll see avatars and things like that. So that's what we're handing out to you guys to play around with. And it's super, super fun. Now, obviously we had X-Rite come and talk to us about measured materials and AXF files and kind of all the power that brings to the table, which I found fascinating. It's just so cool. Love those materials. And then, of course, Wes gave us that amazing presentation of Substance. Obviously, it's connected into UE very nicely with the live link, and the creative possibilities are endless with this kind of suite of tools that we have at our disposal now. So the final thing I want to mention is the fact that we very much want you guys to continue learning about Unreal. We have a whole team dedicated toward learning. So this webinar obviously is more of a demo and a presentation to inspire and try to get you guys to think about the possibilities. But if you want to learn more and do more curriculum-based training, we have that on our website. So make sure you go check that out. The classes are constantly being added to. We do things like Unreal Academy a couple of times a year across the country. So we're very keen on getting information out to you guys in a variety of different ways. So hopefully you're finding it, because Unreal is super, super cool. The more you learn about it, the more you're going to want to learn about it. At least that's how I feel. So that is pretty much it. I'd like to thank you again. Thank you to Marc from X-Rite and to Wes from Substance. And thank you so much to Allegorithmic for allowing us to use their super cool car. So we're going to hang out in the room for about 10 more minutes and answer any questions that come up. And tune back in next month. We'll be doing these webinars pretty regularly. We're trying to shoot for one a month. So thank you for your time, everybody. We all truly appreciate it. Cheers.